President Donald Trump is now weighing in after Republican Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene announced her resignation from Congress Friday night. This comes after a very public fallout with President Trump over the vote to release the Epstein files. The Georgia representative spent 5 years in Congress and was once one of Trump's biggest supporters. The president responded with a post on Truth Social calling her a traitor.
Power doesn't usually announce when it starts to crack. It leaks, quietly, procedurally, through votes that weren't supposed to pass and statements that weren't supposed to be said out loud. That is what you are watching right now. Not a scandal, not a headline. A structural failure unfolding in real time inside the very institution Donald Trump needs to survive. Strip away the noise and the theatrics, and you're left with something far more dangerous for him. The Senate is beginning to behave like a co-equal branch again. It starts with a vote most Americans will never hear about at dinner, 52-47, a procedural motion, dry language, no fireworks, and yet that single number detonates a central pillar of Trump's governing strategy. The Senate moved to block further military action in Venezuela unless Congress explicitly authorizes it. That is not symbolism. That is not messaging. That is Congress reaching back across decades of executive creep and grabbing a power presidents have grown accustomed to treating as personal property. War. For years, presidents of both parties have stretched, bent, and outright ignored the constitutional requirement that Congress declare war. Trump took that erosion and weaponized it. Threats, posturing, escalation without consultation. The assumption that Congress would complain on television and then fall in line. This time, it didn't. 7 Republican senators crossed the line. That number matters, not because 7 is close to a majority, but because 7 is enough to prove a fracture exists. Authoritarian systems do not collapse when the opposition resists. They collapse when the inner circle stops obeying. This was not Democrats doing what Democrats always do. This was Republicans deciding that loyalty to the institution mattered more than fear of the man. The chamber didn't erupt. There were no gasps, no dramatic walkouts, just a quiet rebuke delivered through procedure. The kind of rebuke Trump hates most because he can't scream it away, and he knows exactly what it means. This was not about Venezuela. It was about precedent. It was the Senate saying, clearly and on the record, that the commander-in-chief does not get unilateral permission to edge the country toward conflict. It was Congress reasserting Article 1 authority that has been dormant for far too long. It was a reminder that the presidency is not a throne, and it did not happen in isolation. At the same time this vote passed, another line of resistance hardened around an issue even more revealing of Trump's governing instincts, the assault on the Federal Reserve. When the Department of Justice launched a criminal probe into Fed Chair Jerome Powell for refusing to cut interest rates on Trump's timetable, it crossed a line so bright it should have stopped the process instantly. It didn't. And that, too, forced senators to choose. This time, Republican Senator Thom Tillis said the quiet part out loud. He warned that forces inside the administration were attempting to end the Fed's independence. That is not a technical complaint. That is a flashing red alarm for anyone who understands how modern economies function. An independent central bank is not an academic preference. It is a guardrail against political sabotage of monetary policy. Tear it down, and you invite inflation, instability, and the conversion of economic levers into tools of personal power. Tillis didn't hedge. He didn't couch his language. He pledged to oppose any Federal Reserve nominee until the legal assault on Powell ends. That is a Republican senator threatening to block a Republican president's nominees because the president crossed a constitutional and institutional line. Again, this isn't about personalities. It's about pattern recognition. Trump's governing model depends on intimidation, loyalty enforcement, and the assumption that institutions will fold before he does. That model only works if the institutions believe resistance is futile. The moment resistance becomes survivable, the math changes. Every senator who breaks ranks without being politically annihilated makes the next break easier. That is how internal rebellions begin, not with speeches, with proof. The Senate is providing that proof in increments. Then comes the language shift. When Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer publicly describes the sitting president as an existential threat to democracy, that is not rhetorical excess. That is institutional positioning. Existential is not a casual word in constitutional politics. It is reserved for moments when the system itself is perceived to be at risk. Schumer is not merely criticizing policy. He is framing Trump as incompatible with democratic continuity. That matters because language authorizes action. When a Senate Majority Leader uses the vocabulary of survival, it gives permission to treat the moment as exceptional. It normalizes extraordinary measures. It moves the Overton window inside the Capitol from, "Can we oppose him?" to, "How far must we go?" Schumer has gone further, signaling preparations for potential interference in the 2026 midterms. That is a direct acknowledgement of something many lawmakers whisper but avoid saying publicly, that Trump cannot be trusted to respect electoral boundaries if doing so threatens his power. Once that belief is spoken by leadership, it becomes a planning assumption rather than a conspiracy theory. And while the Senate applies pressure from above and within, the House is laying down the legal architecture beneath it. House Resolution 353 does not read like a protest. It reads like an indictment. 7 articles, not symbolic censure, not vague condemnation. 7 specific charges outlining a theory of presidential misconduct that spans nearly every axis of constitutional governance. Obstruction of justice, interference with investigations, blocking accountability, usurpation of Congress's power of the purse, redirecting funds without authorization, treating appropriations as suggestions. Abuse of trade powers, a tariff regime so aggressive and unmoored from statutory limits that it is now entangled in Supreme Court review. Abuse of war powers, the very behavior the Senate just moved to restrain. First Amendment violations, using state power to punish speech, press, and dissent. Creation of unlawful offices, asserting authority that does not exist in statute or constitutional text. Bribery and corruption, the use of office for personal and political enrichment, and overarching all of it, a charge rarely invoked because of its gravity: tyranny. This is not scattershot. It is cumulative. Each article reinforces the others. Together, they describe a presidency that treats constraint as an enemy and oversight as an obstacle to be crushed. They outline a theory of executive power that collapses the distinction between public office and personal will. If the House impeaches on these grounds, the Senate must hold a trial. There is no procedural escape hatch, and that is where the war powers vote stops being a headline and starts being a warning sign. Because senators who have already demonstrated a willingness to defy Trump on core issues will not be starting from zero in that trial. They will already have crossed the psychological threshold. They will already have chosen institution over individual once. Doing it again becomes easier. This is why Trump is not merely angry. He is panicking. Trump's political identity is built on dominance. He requires submission as proof of legitimacy. When submission weakens, he interprets it as betrayal. His response is always escalation. Louder attacks, more insults, public shaming. He calls senators traitors. He accuses Democrats of corruption. He lashes out at anyone who refuses to fall back in line. But those tactics are calibrated for a different moment. They work when fear outweighs consequence. They fail when the institution begins to believe it can survive without him. Every attack Trump launches against a Republican senator burns a bridge he may later need to cross. Every public insult makes reconciliation less likely. He is isolating himself at precisely the moment coalition maintenance is most critical. And the psychology matters here. Trump does not adapt. He doubles down. He cannot concede ground because concession, to him, is weakness. That instinct may have served him in business disputes and media battles. It is catastrophic in a constitutional confrontation. Institutions respond to pressure differently than individuals. They don't get tired. They don't get distracted. They document. The Senate remembers votes. The courts remember filings. History remembers patterns. What you are witnessing is not a sudden uprising. It is erosion, a slow, grinding removal of support that Trump cannot easily counter because it is happening through legitimate processes. Procedural votes, public statements, legislative threats. These are not spectacles he can dominate with bravado. They are levers designed specifically to restrain a president who refuses restraint. There is no unified Senate demand for resignation. Not yet. That absence is intentional. Premature confrontation can collapse resistance. Incremental pressure, by contrast, forces choices again and again. Each vote, each statement, each refusal to comply pushes the line a little further away from Trump and a little closer to institutional independence, and the timing matters. Midterms are approaching. Every senator is calculating risk. For Democrats, opposing Trump energizes their base. For Republicans, the equation is more complex. The MAGA base dominates primaries, but swing voters dominate general elections in key states. Senators facing competitive races must weigh loyalty against electability. The more Trump becomes associated with chaos, institutional conflict, and economic risk, the more that equation shifts. This creates a feedback loop. Each Republican defection signals to others that dissent is survivable. Each act of resistance lowers the cost of the next. Over time, what begins as isolated courage becomes collective momentum. That is how internal checks reassert themselves after long dormancy. Trump understands this instinctively, which is why he is reacting with fury rather than strategy. He senses the ground moving beneath him, but he lacks the tools to stop it without conceding authority he refuses to give up. The war powers vote will not be the last. The Fed standoff will not resolve quietly. The impeachment resolution will either advance or inspire successors. The pressure will continue because the underlying issue remains unresolved. A president who views constitutional limits as optional and institutions as enemies. This is the test the framers feared but designed for. Article 1 versus Article 2. Oversight versus command. Law versus will. The system is not collapsing. It is straining. And strain reveals weaknesses on both sides. Trump's weakness is his inability to operate within constraint. Congress's weakness has been its reluctance to enforce those constraints. That reluctance is finally showing signs of breaking. History will not remember this moment as a single vote or a single speech. It will remember it as the point when resistance became procedural, when defiance moved from rhetoric into record, when loyalty to one man began to lose to loyalty to the Constitution. Trump is surrounded not by enemies, but by institutions rediscovering their purpose. That is a far more dangerous opponent than any political rival. If you want to understand what comes next, you have to keep watching the small moves, not the shouting. Power rarely falls in one dramatic moment. It erodes until it can no longer support its own weight. Stay alert, because the warning signs don't repeat themselves, and missing them is how democracies learn too late that the damage was already done.